In today's lore of el-melloi Case Files, we return to Gray's hometown, the Blackmore Cemetary, to confront her dark and unresolved past. Welcome back to OtakuDaiKun. Dai here, and it's time to embark on the lore of Lord el-melloi II Case Files Volume 6. While there are some anime-only arcs we could cover, I want to prioritize the light novels, as those are much more obscure, and odds are you haven't read them all. Let's give a special shout-out to Ozzy for translating these later volumes. Last we left off, Waver and Gray resolved the case of Rail Zeppelin. The mysterious former professor, Dr. Heartless, stole Waver's relic of Iskandar in order to summon a heroic spirit of his own. This servant is an extra class named Faker, and is the unnamed sister to Hephaestion, Iskandar's guard and body double. Despite orchestrating a string of murders, Dr. Heartless and Faker were able to escape the ordeal, remaining a potential threat for future volumes. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to like, comment, share, and smash that subscription bell as if it were your waifu. Consider supporting the channel via YouTube membership, Subscribestar, or Patreon. All three platforms give the same perks, such as early access and exclusive content like my Lessons in Magecraft series. Without further ado, let's dive into Volume 6. In the Norwich classroom, Waver grades his students' recent reports. It's Gray's first time writing one, which is odd for her since she's not a mage. It makes her think she doesn't belong at the clock tower. Waver's critiques are harsh, yet constructive, and while Gray's report has issues, he's impressed by one section enough that he'd like to quote it in his own thesis. Flat congratulates her for this, and Sven gets territorial. The two boys fight each other, and Flat tests out a new application of his magecraft. He started programming his own body to act independent from his will. Using only magecraft, he can dodge and react without hesitation, though he's still working out the bugs. Sven, on the other hand, has been building up his magical resistance, to the point where Flat's mana bullets just bounce right off. Whenever this kind of fight breaks out in the classroom, Waver rewards any students who can stop them with personal tutoring or being exempt from reports. As a result, even the students who attend informally jump for joy, launching all manner of magecraft upon the quarreling rivals. The Norwich building was made sturdier to accommodate for these incidents, because otherwise, the department wouldn't be able to afford repairs. After class, Gray goes to visit Rhinus at her mansion. They converse while eating some lavish sweets. Their main topic is how Waver has decided not to enter the Fifth Grail War. While that's been his goal for 10 years now, the appearance of Faker has given him a new mission. As a fellow follower of Iskandar, he feels a responsibility to investigate Faker's actions working for Heartless. This news pisses off Atram Galliasta, who is hoping to use the war to duel Waver in a proper fight. The arrogant prick is already in Japan, preparing for the war. Recall that in the Fourth Holy Grail War, Waver brainwashed an elderly couple into taking care of him. Well, they're on good terms now, and to keep them safe, Waver has set them up to leave the city during the war. Looking back, Rhinus notes that Dr. Heartless must have been involved in the shadows of Waver's previous cases. For example, during the Iselma incident, Heartless was likely the one who offered lots of money to acquire the linden leaf used to pay Toko. Gray declares her desire to help Waver, but in order to do so, she wants to confront her past in her hometown, the Blackmore Cemetary. Before departing, she asks Rhinus to tell her about Waver's first visit there. As such, we get a lengthy flashback. Basically, Waver had been searching the past 7 years for an advantage in the Fifth Grail War. Specifically, he needed to recruit someone who specializes in dealing with spirits. After all, even heroic spirits are a kind of spirit. When he requests leave to visit the Welsh countryside, Rhinus comes along so she can discover his weaknesses. She's a bully, and aside from his video games, Waver doesn't have much of a private life to exploit. The Blackmore Cemetery is at the top of a steep mountain, which Waver notes is common for old religious buildings. The fact that they were difficult to construct made them a better proof of faith, while also keeping them protected from the ever-changing world below. People fear death, and to comfort themselves with its inevitability, they conceive things like the afterlife and the underworld. Many cultures view the underworld as close by, treating death as a new beginning. Graves then are like miniature underworlds, and since this graveyard is one of the world's oldest, Waver wants to recruit a gravekeeper. Right on cue, he and Rhiness encounter an old man named Bursak Blackmore, accompanied by a flock of ravens. Many consider ravens guides for the dead, making the sight both ominous and appropriate. He recognizes Waver as a mage and escorts them to his village regardless. Along the way, they run into Father Fernando Croze, a fat, middle-aged priest with a triple chin. Ever the sadist, Rhiness ponders what would happen if she were to tip him over. Behind him is a younger nun with freckles, Sister Illumia. Fernando claims they can make themselves at home, but Illumia makes it clear they aren't welcome. Regardless, Bursak leads them to the church itself, and inside, they find a Black Madonna, a statue of the Virgin Mary holding baby Jesus. Despite them being mages, Bursak has Waver and Rhiness pray at the statue before heading to his home out back. Typically, the church is at odds with mages, so to ease the tension, Waver affirms that he's not here on Clock Tower business. This is a personal matter. While Waver wants to recruit one of the cemetery's gravekeepers, Bursak isn't sure he can do that right away. For the very first time, Gray enters the room to get further instruction from Bursak, and he tells her to gather some blankets so that Waver and Rhiness can spend the night at a hunting lodge on the town's west side. Before they go to settle in, Bursak tells them of 4 rules they have to follow if they plan to stay. They've already fulfilled one, which is praying to the statue. The other 3 pertain to where they go snooping around. They are never to go out at night, never visit the graveyard alone, and never enter the swamp. The lodge itself is disgusting, riddled with dust mites and a nasty stink. While Waver is used to this from his travels, Rhiness cleans up the place with herbal magecraft. Refusing to go without certain comforts, she beckons forth Trimau, whom she smuggled on the train and up the mountains with some extra luggage. Rhiness also finds it easier to sleep while holding Trimau's hand. Aww. In the morning, Trimau prepares tea and the usual pâté for Rhiness, while also combing Waver's unruly hair. Since there are 2 of them, Waver and Rhiness figure they can visit the graveyard during the daytime. Luckily, Bursak has sent Gray to be their guide around the village. Outside the lodge, a gust of wind blows Gray's hood out of her face, causing Waver to shriek in terror. He's alarmed by how Gray has the same face as Artoria, the woman he fought in the 4th Grail War. Rudely, he asks her to put her hood back on. Despite Gray's timid nature, the villagers treat her like royalty, or even an object of worship. As requested, she takes them to the graveyard itself, where she asks about Waver's goal in visiting. Ideally, he'd like to hire Bursak, and the thought of leaving the city excites Gray. She's lived in this village her whole life, only learning of the world outside through books. Bursak chose her to be his successor about 9 years ago, but she doubts her qualifications as a gravekeeper since she's afraid of ghosts. Gray's mother comes to get her, as it's time to pray. They can't miss out on their prayers on account of Gray's important body. Important body? What a weird thing for a mom to say to her daughter. Left alone, Waver finds this village suspicious and asks Rhiness to use her mystic eyes to look for spiritual activity. She concentrates, sensing a high density of spirits, but they're all swarmed together in a big blur. The only thing she can identify is a set of threads that point toward a dilapidated windmill by the swamp. Its monotrail is discernible enough that whoever left it did so without fear of being found. As such, Waver and Rhiness visit the windmill and discover that inside is the workshop of an Atlas alchemist. To their utter astonishment, they encounter the Atlas Institute's director, Zepia Metlasia, a man who has lived for over 100 years by becoming a dead apostle. Because of this, he remains secluded in the windmill, avoiding sunlight. If you're not aware, Atlas is a branch of the Mages Association on par with the Clock Tower. They tend to study in secret at their base in Egypt, utilizing an older form of alchemy than what most mages use today. Of the association, Atlas alchemists are the most technologically savvy, developing mystic codes that aid them in predicting and trying to prevent the end of the world. It's odd to find Zepia here, so far from his domain, but Atlas Tech helps him stay in touch. The strongest of Atlas mages use a technique called memory partition that lets them split their consciousness into different parallel processes. This makes Zepia an expert in calculation, to the point where he can predict Waver and Rhiness's questions before they can even ask them. He notes that the Blackmore Cemetary is special, in that it was originally watched over by the dead apostle Grandsurg Blackmore. The immortality of dead apostles isn't perfect, and as such, Grandsurg passed on long ago, leaving the land to his heirs. Having already anticipated their meeting, Zepia tells Waver that he, the new head of modern magecraft theory, will soon have to make a decision that brings him closer to the Fifth Grail War. Catching up to them, Burzak reaches the windmill and demands to speak with Waver and Rhinus outside. Apparently, someone was wandering around last night, breaking one of the village rules. Occasionally, this can happen when kids go out to play, and while Burzak has the ability to detect when certain rules are broken, he can't sense who is doing it. Waver defends that neither he nor Rhinus stepped outside, but he also suspects that Burzak could be reacting to someone entering the village rather than one of the villagers leaving their homes after dark. He also prods into whether the 4 rules have anything to do with the Atlas organization. Refusing to answer, Burzak instead declares that, while there is someone in the village with the spiritual power Waver seeks, she can't be permitted to leave. Immediately, Waver can tell it's a reference to Grey, the girl with King Arthur's face. Naturally, this is a wild thing to say, given Waver only knows this because he had the chance to actually meet Artoria. This finally gets Burzak's attention, and he requests to speak with Waver in private. Taking the hint, Rhinus heads back, not just to the lodge, but all the way back to the clock tower. Waver sent her home according to his judgment, thinking it would be safer for her. Back in the present, Rhinus' story ends, admitting that when Waver came back, he already had Grey in tow as his disciple. While Grey had no idea someone like Zepia was staying at the village's windmill, she's the only person who knows the rest of the story. As such, Rhinus asks her to become the storyteller. Grey refuses, only mentioning that she died back in the village. Before telling that tale, she wants to return to the village by herself to confront her past. By doing so, Grey hopes to be strong enough to fight toe-to-toe with heroic spirits like Hephaestion. While she's prepared to travel alone, it seems Waver too is hoping to revisit the cemetery. He enters the room, explaining how it was odd that Zepia called him the new head of modern magecraft, even though he'd already had the job for 7 years. Taking this as a hint to Dr. Heartless, the previous department head, Waver believes going back can give him a clue. Supposedly, there's a 1-month gap in their accounts where it's possible Heartless actually met with Zepia. Knowing his own limitations, Waver asks Grey to accompany him, and for good measure, he recruits Flat and Sven to join as well. Normally, Ad is a literal chatterbox, but he's mysteriously silent regarding this whole ordeal. The trip back to the cemetery is more exciting the second time around thanks to Flat and Sven. Seeing the swamp makes Flat think of a horror movie with a chainsaw killer that targets lovers first. Sven realizes this is why Tremau has been repeating movie quotes lately. She does parrot a lot of what Flat teaches her after all. Grey is thankful that she now has a reason to return to her hometown for more than just pain. That said, Waver doesn't want the villagers to recognize her, so he has Flat cast an illusory spell that changes her appearance. By manipulating light, Flat gives her a brand new face, which excites both Grey and Waver. She's been stuck with someone else's face for so long that, even though it's just an illusion, she feels liberated. The spell is tied to one of the buttons on her dress, so as long as she keeps it buttoned up, the effect will last. They decide to enter the village and pray at the Black Madonna. Grey explains that Burzak really can tell when the rules are broken, as she once got lost near the swamp and he found her almost immediately. When Flat inquires about when Grey left for the first time, Waver vaguely explains that her corpse showed up at the church. It wasn't actually her, but rather a substitute that looked like her. Afterward, Burzak gave Grey to Waver and forced them to leave the village. She was never supposed to come back, which is why they need to hide her face. Back then, neither of them questioned what happened. Regardless of whose body was discovered that night, it was convenient for Grey to leave and for Waver to get what he wanted. The truth of that mystery remains undiscovered. Ad still isn't speaking, and even after Grey tries to get his attention, he mumbles that he's trying to sleep. She didn't even know that he could sleep until now. Their arrival is accompanied by falling snow and the ominous fact that the entire village has been abandoned. Nobody is in sight, not even at the church. The villagers must have been missing for a while, yet there's no sign of a struggle. Instead, all Sven can smell is an abnormal pattern of mana. Waver sends out Sven and Flat to investigate as a team, while he and Grey explore familiar areas. While Sven's bestial magecraft is hella useful, and what got him to the rank of Pride, it hasn't been an easy journey. Since turning into a beast requires one's own body, there are many mages who simply aren't capable of transforming. Sven's body is especially compatible, and it was tested through a number of brutal experiments in his childhood. Things like peeling back his skin to test regeneration. Originally, it was less that he was a mage and more a vessel for his family's craft. He fears being an outsider in that regard, which is why Gray's scent, as a fellow outcast, comforts him, and he can still smell Gray's scent all over the village. Unafraid of the taboos, he and Flat head straight for the swamp. Sven's nose sniffs out the presence of an ancient bounded field, but it's nothing Flat can't dismantle with his whimsical spells. When the barrier lifts, a new path appears through the forest. Not only were people not supposed to enter the swamp, they wouldn't have been able to because of that bounded field. Confirming they aren't welcome, Flat detects an ice trap ahead, and while he tries to disable it, he sneezes midway, setting off the trap. Luckily, Sven is able to smash the ice arrows en route. After their encounter with Toko, both of them have been stepping up their game. Further in, they encounter yet another defense measure, a shadowy silhouette that looks just like Gray holding her scythe. Rather, that's what Sven sees anyway. After the shadow swings down at him, it vanishes. Apparently, Flat saw a much blurrier shadow. Shortly after, the two are swept up in a literal wave of spirits that carries them away, as if the spirits were fleeing from something. Meanwhile, the actual Gray accompanies Waver to the windmill. In truth, Waver doesn't want his students meeting with Zepia. Assuming he's still there, it would be too dangerous. That said, he needs Gray for his own protection. Along with the scent of red wine, Zepia greets Waver, having already anticipated their reunion. At Gray's request, Zepia explains that the village is currently suffering from the effects of a certain contract made long before he became director. Specifically, it is part of the Contract of Atlas, a collection of 7 ancient contracts scattered across the globe. Tales of them at the clock tower include a warning: lift not the seals of Atlas, lest ye destroy the world 7 times over. These seals refer to 7 superweapons Atlas created. They have the ability to save the world as well as end it. Very little is known about these weapons. We know one of them is a sword, but that's about it. The most famous superweapon is Black Barrel, a conceptual weapon that can impose the idea of a limited lifespan even on immortal beings. It's a gun that lets you kill pretty much anything. In Fate Grand Order, Mashu uses a replica of it to slay the Olympian gods. The only other superweapon we know of is featured in this volume. Fearing the worst, Waver asks about Dr. Heartless. Choosing to just answer all of Waver's questions in advance, Zepia admits he did make some kind of deal with Heartless. Furthermore, this village is home to the Atlas superweapon Logos React. Spewing forth a slew of mechanical noises, Zepia chants a spell that distorts the reality around them. Turns out, the guy's been using more than just his own brain to observe multiple possibilities. Put bluntly, Logos React is a pseudo-spiritron computer that simulates virtual worlds. By specifying certain conditions, it's possible for the user to create different simulations and subject victims to those simulations as though they were in a dream. Instructing Waver to solve this mystery, to overcome this challenge, Zepia uses Logos React to trap his 2 visitors in a fictional world. In it, Gray wakes up in her old home, confronted by the voice of her mother baking bread. It's the morning after she first guided Waver and Rhinus around the village. Afraid and confused, Gray goes along with this, struggling to eat while carrying conversation. Her mom steps out to visit the Black Madonna and then go see a person called Grandma. Before leaving, she reminds Gray that while her duties as a gravekeeper are important, she ought to focus on being the blessed child. Left alone, Gray turns to Ad for comfort. He, however, is still fast asleep, as though his eyes were carved that way. While she feels like this is a dream from the past, for a moment, Gray worries that perhaps her time in London was the dream. Outside, she runs into Fernando and Illumia, who inquire more about Waver and Rhinus' motives for coming. They seem to be behaving just like they did years prior. Fittingly, Gray goes through her normal routine, visiting Burzak behind the church. She tries to ask him if anything strange is going on, but backs down when he doesn't understand. He mentions how Waver knew of Artoria's face. The first time she heard this news, Gray felt validation in Waver's fear. It was good to have someone else who feared her face, knowing full well who it belongs to. Burzak asks her to show Waver around the village again, which makes her wonder if the Waver she's about to meet will even remember their time together at the clock tower. Thankfully, when she heads to the lodge, she finds that Waver is aware of the dream as well. They both recall Zepia's strange spell before waking up in the past. Theoretically, magecraft can be used to send people back in time, but only on the level of true magic or a massive collaborative effort. No way in hell that many mages would work together to pull this off. That said, if they truly are in the past, then Gray's dead body will be discovered at the church tomorrow morning. Back then, Waver was hoping to inquire about the ritual involving Gray's face and Ad, but the murder interrupted things. Waver realizes this is Zepia challenging him to solve the case. The first time around, today was the day that Waver asked Gray to be his disciple. She had no idea if that was possible, nor what it would entail, but she was moved by his conviction. In order to investigate, they decide to change their behavior this time. Waver calls this dream, illusion, whatever it is, the second cycle. Much to Gray's disapproval, Waver already confirmed that Zepia isn't in the windmill. While most of the villagers are busy visiting a merchant that's come to town, Gray and Waver decide to hit up the church. Apparently, unlike the other villagers, Fernando and Illumia didn't grow up here, so they don't seem to be as obsessed with the matter of Gray's face. Their attention turns to the statue. Waver samples some of the dust on it to confirm that it's some kind of spell. Interpreting it as a relay point, he takes out a chained jewel and dangles it like a dowsing rod. This points him in the direction of a nearby storage room, where he discovers a hidden staircase that leads deep underground. Outside, the villagers are excited, shopping from the merchant that visits once a month. Illumia didn't come here to shop. Instead, she's retrieving a letter sent to her. She pays her respects to the oldest woman around, Granny. This old lady is supposedly over 100, and she remarks that there's a sound coming from underground, a sound she hasn't heard since she was a child. Speaking to Gray's mother, they both agree that today is the day that Gray will shine. In certain cultures, the underworld is actually a place you can visit. Descending the stairs beneath the church feels like venturing into such an underworld. Strangely, Gray can't sense any spirits here, whereas she can usually always sense some form of death. The tunnel has footprints, so how is there no trace of death or mana to be found? Even more confusing, the path opens up, revealing dozens of skeletons cluttering the floor. The two stand in awe as these skeletons rise in the air, transforming into bone soldiers that start attacking. Luckily, Ad can still become a scythe, which Gray uses to fight back. From behind the soldiers, an armored king stands to command the dead. It is the figure of a woman, clad in armor from head to toe. Mentally, the woman tells Gray that the time is not right for the once and future king to awaken. She proceeds deeper into the catacombs, and when Gray tries to follow, the bone soldiers stand in the way. Hoping to break through, Gray attempts to turn Ad into a hammer, but Ad weakly apologizes. It seems the scythe is the best he can do, and it's not enough to hold off the skeletons. Gray cries out, begging for Ad to wake up, and suddenly, the scythe shines bright. Meanwhile, Illumia returns to the church proper. Her letter is from the Holy Church, informing her and Fernando that it's time for Gray to awaken. They plan to kill her, just as the Holy Church once killed the dead Apostle Gransurg. They must see Gray as a heretic. Out back, Bursak hears the cry of a raven. He's familiar with the sound, and notes that it's a different cry tonight. He used to like this village, until Gray began her transformation, that is. Reluctantly, he picks up a giant axe. Beyond this fantasy, Zepia stares at Logos react and its many converging timelines. From within the darkness around him, both Flat and Sven wake up. Somehow, they've managed to reach the lighthouse after the spirits swept them away. Zepia's impressed these students were able to interfere, but his eyes are still fixated on Logos. Specifically, he is watching Ad as he lights up. Back in the fantasy, a knight in silver armor emerges. It's Sir Kay, whom Ad's personality was based on. Miraculously, Kay was called forth via a forced summoning. Even in an incomplete state, he slashes through the skeletons with ease. He's not too happy to be here, but he is impressed that he was summoned by someone who can't even manipulate mana. After laughing in a familiar tone, Gray discovers that this is Ad, or rather his original form as a human. The volume ends at this point. Like the previous few volumes, this one's a two-parter. As such, we'll need to figure out what happens to Gray and the others next time. Look forward to it. Thanks for watching!
If you enjoy this channel, help us grow by liking, commenting, sharing the video, subscribing to OtakuDaiKun, and
most of all, smashing that notification bell so you don't miss out on all of our anime discussion, lore, or Let's Play content.
You can support us directly through Patreon, Subscribestar, or our YouTube membership. all of which come with benefits like exclusive vids and early access.
As always,
Celebrate your fandom!
I want to give a special shout out to all my $10 and up supporters: Video Gamer 75, Stephen Elak, Samuel Gersten, The Nonchalant Ostrich, Otaku Mom, Jens Bauman, Mystic Samurai 1983, Olympian Doll, Lord Omagoden, Freebrick, RNG Shuffles 1498, Alexis Yukio Gomez Yamato, Link Pendrago, King Kobo, Observer Bellis, Flash Daniel, Eldon Yarbrough, James Hewitt, Uncanny EXP, Zamas Autonomous, Matthew McAfee, Game King 352, Caitlin P., Vladimir Ovna, Succubus Sakura, Norm Ace, Jonathan Badua, The Taz 96, President Irina Vladimirovna Putina, Maxwell's Demon, Kengo X77, SF Giants fan Mike, and Akakaze Yume. Thank you all so much.